Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. If you've ever stared at a really dense poem or a complex novel and thought, what is actually going on beneath the surface here? Well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're taking the foundational maps of the human mind and applying them directly to the books we read, essentially building a practical detective's toolkit for analyzing literature. Right up front, I should mention that this explainer is made by the English Lit on YouTube. Our goal here is to help students who are new to literary criticism demystify these really complex theoretical frameworks. Literary theory can sometimes feel like an entirely different language, but by using simple analogies and focusing on clear concepts, we're going to make these ideas incredibly accessible. Here is how we are going to map out our expedition today. First, mapping the human psyche, then decoding universal archetypes. Third, the anxiety of influence. Fourth, feminism and the imaginary. And finally, beyond the Oedipal triangle. All right, let's get into it with Section 1, Mapping the Human Psyche, where we'll be exploring the hidden basement. So, using a pretty simple analogy to start us off, think of the human psyche as a massive iceberg, or maybe a dark, locked basement. The everyday thoughts that you're actually aware of, your consciousness, that's literally just the tiny tip of the iceberg poking out above the water. The vast, overwhelming majority of our thoughts, desires, and fears are actually lodged entirely out of sight, way beneath the surface. To really understand this dark, totally inaccessible sphere we call the unconscious, we've got to look for the leaks. The unconscious is packed with deeply buried, repressed, and self-censored wishes. And while it is locked away, clues to what's inside constantly leak out. They slip through the cracks via free association, fantasies, those embarrassing Freudian slips, and especially through our dreams. Sigmund Freud actually believed that our nightly dream work acts like a cryptic cipher. Because our unconscious wishes are usually things our waking minds would totally reject, often taboo or socially unacceptable stuff, our brain actively censors them while we sleep. It puts these wishes through 4 specific steps of deliberate distortion: condensation, displacement, symbolization, and secondary revision. By the time the dream actually reaches our consciousness, the original wish has been twisted and masked so much that it just emerges as garbled nonsense. So here's the crucial point. In psychoanalysis, quote, "Nonsense is meaningful and distortion is inescapable and creative." Why does this matter for us as readers? Because literary critics use these exact same psychoanalytic tools to decode cryptic symbolic novels and poems. They treat literature just like a dream waiting to be deciphered, looking past the literal nonsense of a challenging text to find the hidden, repressed desires driving the whole thing. Moving right along to Section 2, Decoding Universal Archetypes and looking at the collective unconscious. Now, Carl Jung was a colleague of Freud, but he took this idea of the unconscious in a slightly different direction. Jungian critics use an incredible lens to read literature by looking for archetypes. So what are those? Well, archetypes are essentially universal symbols shared across all of humanity. Jung believed that we don't just have an individual unconscious, we actually share a collective unconscious as a species, like a giant historical reservoir of human experience. And you see these archetypes absolutely everywhere in literature. When you're decoding a text for class, spotting these universal symbols immediately reveals deep collective meanings hidden within the story. Take the classic archetype of the hero embarking on an ordeal, or the harsh, testing environment of the desert. If you recognize the hero or the desert in a modern novel, you suddenly connect that book to thousands of years of human storytelling. It's basically like finding the master key to a text's deeper meaning. That brings us perfectly to Section 3, the anxiety of influence, or what I like to call the rebellious teenager dynamic. Literary critic Harold Bloom argued that ever since the Romantic period, literary influence hasn't really been a friendly passing of the baton. It became baleful and downright hostile. Think of it through this simple analogy. The newcomer poet acts exactly like a rebellious teenager. This teenager idolizes their powerful parent figure, the precursor poet, but desperately wants to conquer them, to establish their own independent identity. They want to be the new master for sure, but they are absolutely terrified of just being a copycat. To survive this intense anxiety of influence, the newcomer relies on a fascinating defense mechanism that Bloom calls misprision. Misprision basically means mistaking, misreading, or misinterpreting the older poet's work. The newcomer poet unconsciously enacts a creative distortion. They have to repress and deliberately misunderstand the precursor in order to clear creative space for themselves. This perfectly illustrates how the anxiety of influence practically forces creative distortion in poetry. The newcomer is imitating, sure, but they're also violently competing with a loved but hated predecessor. It's such a brilliant way for literary critics to understand how writers build upon and rebel against tradition. When you read a modern poem, you aren't just reading words on a page, you're reading a psychological battlefield where the poet is unconsciously wrestling the ghosts of their literary parents. Let's dive into Section 4, Feminism and the Imaginary, where we'll look at breaking the patriarchal grid. To get this one, we first need to look at psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan's map of human development. Lacan argued that as infants, we all start out in what he called the imaginary order. This is a mother-centered, pre-Oedipal space full of natural bodily drives and rhythms. There's no language yet, it's purely instinctual. But to grow up, we are forced to move into the symbolic order. This is the realm of language, separation, the law, and strict patriarchal social codes. Basically, you leave the mother's rhythm behind to enter the father's rules. Now notice how French feminist Hélène Cixous takes this psychoanalytic map and uses it for a literal literary rebellion. She champions a concept called écriture féminine, which translates to feminine writing. This is a radical, highly disruptive mode of writing designed to break the rigid grid of patriarchal grammar and categories. How does it do that? By tapping straight back into those pre-verbal bodily rhythms of the imaginary order. Traditionally, that pre-Oedipal stage was seen as something totally irrational, just an infantile domain you're supposed to grow out of. But Cixous completely flips the script. Rather than viewing it as a phase to outgrow, the psychopoetics reclaims the imaginary as a huge, liberating source of creativity. It gives voice to the unconscious and the body. And crucially, while it is called feminine writing, Cixous points out that this disruptive, flowing style can actually be produced by both female and male writers. James Joyce is a great example of someone who famously shattered traditional grammar and structure using this kind of energy. Finally, we've reached our last stop, Section 5, Beyond the Oedipal Triangle, exploring the process of becoming. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari basically looked at Freud's map of the mind and said, you know what, this map is way too small. They argue that Freudian theory wrongly subjugates the wild, disruptive power of the unconscious to the hegemonic order of the patriarchal family and the capitalist economy. Freud assumed that the nuclear family, that classic Oedipal triangle of mother, father, and child, was the universal framework for all normal human development. But Deleuze and Guattari strongly criticized this as a super-limited bourgeois presupposition. They entirely shatter that classic Oedipal triangle. For them, human subjectivity isn't just some fixed family drama that you have to resolve. Instead, subjectivity is a really complex, open-ended process of becoming. It's a dynamic state where multiple, often completely contradictory positions, roles, and desires constantly coexist and clash within us. We are not just products of our parents, we're shaped by society, economics, and these wild antisocial flows of desire. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. As you take this psychoanalytic detective's toolkit into your own studies, how might replacing those rigid structures with an open-ended, clashing psychological map completely transform your next reading assignment? When you look at a character, maybe stop seeing just a set of fixed family traumas and start looking for that clashing process of becoming. Use the unconscious, look for those archetypes, spot the anxiety of influence, and embrace the creative distortion. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating map with me, and happy decoding!